The security camera footage would later become the most watched video in corporate scandal history, replayed millions of times across social media platforms, and dissected frame by legal experts. But before we get to that devastating moment at the charity gala that would destroy lives and topple an empire, you need to understand how Sarah Mitchell went from a confident marketing executive with dreams of building a family to a broken woman whose world was about to shatter in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. Sarah Elizabeth Cameron had always been a small-town dreamer with big city ambitions. Growing up in Marysville, Ohio, population 8,000, she was the kind of girl who organized charity drives in high school, graduated valedictorian, and believed wholeheartedly that hard work and good intentions could overcome any obstacle. Her parents, both public school teachers, had instilled in her a deep sense of right and wrong, along with an unshakable faith that people were fundamentally decent if you gave them the chance to prove it. This optimistic worldview served Sarah well through college at Ohio State University, where she studied marketing and communications with a minor in business administration. She was the student who stayed after class to ask thoughtful questions, who volunteered for every group project, and who genuinely believed that business could be a force for positive change in the world. Her professors loved her enthusiasm, her classmates respected her work ethic, and her grades reflected a combination of natural intelligence and relentless dedication. At 22, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and a head full of ideas about how to help businesses connect with their communities, Sarah landed what seemed like a dream job at Mitchell Tech Solutions in downtown Columbus. The company occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in the Short North Arts District, and everything about it felt young, innovative, and full of possibility. Mitchell Tech Solutions specialized in providing technology infrastructure for small and medium-sized businesses across the Midwest. They helped family-owned restaurants implement point-of-sale systems, assisted manufacturing companies with inventory management software, and guided retail stores through the transition to online sales platforms. It was exactly the kind of work that appealed to Sarah's belief that technology should serve people, not the other way around. The company was small then, just 15 employees working in an open concept space filled with standing desks, whiteboards covered in flowcharts, and a kitchen stocked with artisanal coffee and healthy snacks. The atmosphere was collaborative and energetic, with weekly team meetings that felt more like brainstorming sessions among friends than corporate presentations. David Mitchell was 29 when Sarah first met him, and he was unlike any other entrepreneur she had encountered during her job interviews. While other tech executives wore hoodies and sneakers and spoke in jargon about disruption and scalability, David showed up to work in actual business suits, held doors open for women, and talked about building something meaningful that would last for generations. He had founded Mitchell Tech Solutions 3 years earlier with money borrowed from his grandfather, a successful farmer who believed that technology could help small businesses compete with corporate giants. David often spoke about his grandfather's influence, about growing up on a farm in rural Tennessee where handshake deals still mattered and your reputation was your most valuable asset. During Sarah's first week on the job, David personally walked her through every department, introducing her to each employee by name and explaining how their role contributed to the company's mission. He asked thoughtful questions about her background, her career goals, and her ideas for improving their marketing strategies. When Sarah presented her first campaign proposal 2 weeks later, David listened carefully to every detail before offering constructive feedback that showed he had actually read and understood her work. Their professional relationship quickly developed into something deeper. David began stopping by Sarah's desk to discuss projects that could have been handled via email. He started inviting her to client lunches where her marketing expertise could add value to business development conversations. When the company celebrated landing their biggest contract to date, David specifically thanked Sarah in his speech to the entire team, crediting her innovative social media campaign for helping them win the account. The attraction between them was obvious to everyone in the office, but both Sarah and David maintained strict professional boundaries for months. Sarah had never dated a boss before and was concerned about how a relationship might affect her career. David seemed equally cautious, often mentioning his policy about keeping business and personal matters separate. But fate, as it often does, intervened during the company Christmas party. Sarah had been talking with clients near the bar when she overheard two competitors discussing Mitchell Tech Solutions with barely concealed jealousy. They were praising David's business acumen and speculating about how quickly the company was growing. When one of them mentioned that David was probably the most eligible bachelor in Columbus's business community, Sarah felt a sharp pang of something that might have been jealousy. Later that evening, David found Sarah on the roof deck of the venue, looking out over the city lights with a thoughtful expression. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, joining her at the railing. "Just thinking about how much the company has grown since I started," Sarah replied. "You should be proud of what you've built here." "We've built," David corrected. "Your marketing campaigns are a huge part of our success. I hope you know how much I value your contributions." They talked for an hour about the company's future plans, about David's vision for expanding into new markets, and about Sarah's ideas for building brand recognition across the Midwest. But underneath the professional conversation was an undercurrent of personal connection that neither of them could ignore. When David finally asked Sarah out to dinner the following week, she said yes immediately. Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant in German Village, where they talked until the servers started stacking chairs around them. David was charming and attentive, asking questions about Sarah's family, her dreams, and her thoughts on everything from politics to literature. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, and he shared stories about his own background that revealed depth and vulnerability beneath his polished exterior. Their courtship unfolded over 6 months of dinners, weekend trips to small towns across Ohio, and long conversations about building something meaningful together. David took Sarah to meet his grandfather in Tennessee, a kind but sharp-eyed man who grilled her about her intentions and her character before giving his approval. Sarah introduced David to her parents, who were initially skeptical of their daughter dating her boss, but eventually warmed to his obvious devotion and his respectful treatment of their family. David proposed on the anniversary of their first date in the same Italian restaurant where they had talked until closing time. The ring was Sarah's grandmother's diamond, which David had somehow convinced Sarah's mother to let him use without Sarah knowing. His proposal speech was heartfelt and specific, referencing inside jokes and shared memories that made Sarah cry happy tears before she could even say yes. They were married 8 months later in a ceremony that made the society pages of Columbus Monthly magazine. Sarah wore her grandmother's dress, carefully altered to fit her figure, and David cried during his vows as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for the rest of their lives. The reception was held at the same venue where they had first kissed, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues who all agreed they had never seen a more perfectly matched couple. For the first 3 years of their marriage, Sarah felt like she was living in a fairy tale. David's business continued to grow, expanding from 15 employees to over 50, then to over 100. Sarah's marketing expertise helped fuel the company's expansion, and she became known throughout Columbus's business community as one half of a power couple that represented the best of entrepreneurial success. They bought a beautiful house in Upper Arlington, a prestigious suburb with tree-lined streets and well-maintained historic homes. Sarah decorated it with a mixture of family antiques and carefully chosen modern pieces, creating a space that felt both elegant and welcoming. David often brought clients home for dinner, and Sarah enjoyed playing hostess, preparing elaborate meals and facilitating conversations that often led to new business relationships. But success, as Sarah would later learn, has a way of changing people in ways that are not always immediately visible. The man who had once personally walked her through every department and asked thoughtful questions about her background began to evolve into someone more distant, more focused on growth and expansion than on the personal relationships that had originally motivated his business philosophy. The changes started small. David began working longer hours, explaining that rapid growth required his constant attention. He started traveling more frequently, attending conferences and meeting with potential investors in other cities. Business dinners became weekly occurrences, then nightly expectations that often kept him away from home until well past midnight. When Sarah suggested they start trying to have children during their third year of marriage, David seemed enthusiastic about the idea. He talked about converting the spare bedroom into a nursery, about teaching their future children to ride bikes in their quiet neighborhood, and about continuing the family legacy his grandfather had started on that Tennessee farm. But when Sarah actually became pregnant at 27, David's reaction was more complicated than she had expected. While he expressed happiness about the baby, he also seemed overwhelmed by the additional responsibilities that parenthood would bring. He worried aloud about the financial pressures of raising children, despite the fact that his company was more profitable than ever. He expressed concerns about how pregnancy and motherhood might affect Sarah's ability to contribute to the business, even though she had never mentioned wanting to stop working. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed through the first trimester, David became increasingly preoccupied with work. He missed the first ultrasound appointment because of what he described as a client emergency that could not be rescheduled. He forgot about the gender reveal appointment altogether, claiming that his calendar had been mixed up by his new assistant. The assistant was Jessica Torres, a 26-year-old recent MBA graduate who had been hired to help manage David's increasingly complex schedule and growing list of responsibilities. Jessica was smart, ambitious, and undeniably attractive, with the kind of polished confidence that comes from growing up in Dallas society and attending elite universities. She spoke fluent Spanish and Mandarin, had internship experience at Fortune 500 companies, and interviewed better than any candidate David had ever met. From a professional standpoint, Jessica was exactly what Mitchell Tech Solutions needed as it transitioned from a small startup to a major regional player. She brought organizational skills that allowed David to focus on strategy rather than logistics, and she had connections in the business community that opened doors to new opportunities. From a personal standpoint, Jessica's arrival marked the beginning of the end of Sarah's marriage, though it would be months before Sarah understood the full extent of what was happening. The first sign something had changed was David's attitude toward Sarah's pregnancy. Where he had once been excited about doctor's appointments and baby preparations, he now seemed to view her growing belly as an inconvenience that complicated his increasingly busy schedule. When Sarah suggested they take a baby moon vacation before the baby arrived, David claimed he could not afford to take time away from work during such a critical growth period. When Sarah decided to quit her job during her second trimester, thinking she should focus on preparing for motherhood and supporting David's expanding business, he encouraged the decision perhaps a little too enthusiastically. At the time, Sarah interpreted his enthusiasm as evidence that he wanted her to be able to focus fully on their family. Looking back, she would realize that removing her from the office also removed her from daily observation of his interactions with Jessica. But during those hopeful months of her second trimester, Sarah was too busy preparing for motherhood to notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. She spent her days reading parenting books, organizing the nursery, and attending prenatal yoga classes with other expectant mothers. She felt grateful for the financial security that allowed her to focus on her pregnancy without worrying about work deadlines or office politics. It was not until her third trimester that Sarah began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. David's work schedule became even more demanding, with meetings that ran until midnight and business trips that stretched over entire weekends. His phone, which had always been casually accessible, suddenly required password protection and was never left unattended. When Sarah asked about the changes, David had reasonable explanations for everything. The company was at a critical juncture that required his constant attention. Investors were demanding detailed reports and frequent updates. Competition in their industry was intensifying, and maintaining their market position required strategic thinking that could not be rushed or delegated. All of these explanations made sense from a business perspective. What made Sarah uncomfortable was the way David delivered them, with a practiced smoothness that felt more like a sales presentation than a conversation between husband and wife. The man who had once shared every detail of his business challenges and victories now spoke in generalities and deflected follow-up questions with vague references to confidentiality requirements and competitive sensitivity. But Sarah wanted to trust her husband, especially during such a vulnerable time in her life. She was 7 months pregnant, completely financially dependent on David's income, and deeply invested in the belief that their marriage was strong enough to weather any temporary challenges. The alternative, that David might be lying to her about something fundamental, was too terrifying to seriously consider. So Sarah chose to believe David's explanations, to trust in the love they had built together, and to focus on preparing for the arrival of their first child. She had no way of knowing that David's deception went far deeper than a simple affair, or that the beautiful life they had built together was actually constructed on a foundation of lies that would soon collapse in the most public and devastating way imaginable. The perfect husband Sarah thought she had married was about to reveal himself as someone entirely different, and the fairy tale she had been living was about to become the nightmare that would define the rest of her life. The first concrete sign that something was seriously wrong came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, when Sarah was 32 weeks pregnant and feeling increasingly isolated in the beautiful house that had once represented everything she wanted in life. David had left that morning for what he described as a day-long strategic planning session with his senior team, including Jessica, who had become increasingly central to the company's operations over the past several months. The meeting was supposedly being held at a corporate retreat center outside Columbus, and David had mentioned that it might run late into the evening. Sarah had planned to spend the day organizing baby clothes and setting up the nursery, but persistent lower back pain had made it difficult to concentrate on physical tasks. Instead, she found herself sitting in the living room, trying to read a parenting book, while her mind wandered to concerns she could not quite articulate. She had been feeling disconnected from David's daily life for weeks. His explanations about work had become increasingly vague, and his attention seemed focused on challenges he would not discuss in detail. When Sarah asked specific questions about the company's projects or his interactions with specific clients, David would provide brief, unsatisfying answers before changing the subject. The isolation was particularly difficult because Sarah had given up her own career to focus on the pregnancy. Without the daily interactions and intellectual challenges of her marketing work, she felt increasingly dependent on David for both financial security and emotional connection. But David seemed less available for meaningful conversation with each passing week. That afternoon, while trying to distract herself from her growing unease, Sarah decided to surprise David by having lunch delivered to his office. She knew he often forgot to eat during intense meetings, and she thought a thoughtful gesture might help bridge the growing distance between them. She called David's office number, expecting to reach him directly or get his voicemail. Instead, the call was answered by the company's receptionist, who sounded surprised to hear from Sarah. "Oh, Mrs. Mitchell," the young woman said, her voice carrying an odd note of confusion. "I didn't realize you were trying to reach David today." "I just wanted to have lunch sent over to the retreat center," Sarah explained. "Could you give me the address where the planning session is being held?" There was a long pause before the receptionist responded. "Planning session? I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell, but I don't have any information about an off-site meeting today. David and Jessica are both here in the office." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "They're in the office? Are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am. They've been in David's office all morning with the door closed. They asked not to be disturbed unless there was an emergency." Sarah thanked the receptionist and hung up, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had just learned. David had specifically told her that morning that he would be at an off-site retreat center all day. But according to the office receptionist, he was in his office with Jessica, behind a closed door, with instructions not to be disturbed. The lie was so obvious and unnecessary that Sarah could not understand why David would tell it. If he needed to work privately with Jessica on important projects, why not just say so? What was happening behind that closed door that required deception and secrecy? For the next hour, Sarah sat in her living room trying to convince herself that there must be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the retreat had been canceled at the last minute. Maybe David had forgotten to mention the change in plans. Maybe the receptionist was confused about the details of David's schedule. But no matter how she tried to rationalize the situation, Sarah could not escape the growing certainty that David had deliberately lied to her about his whereabouts. And if he was lying about something as simple as where he was spending his day, what else might he be lying about? That evening, David came home at his usual time, looking tired but not particularly stressed. He kissed Sarah's cheek and asked about her day, before launching into a detailed description of the strategic planning session and the various challenges they had discussed. Sarah listened to his elaborate fabrication with growing horror. David described conversations that had never happened, decisions that had never been made, and insights that had supposedly emerged from a meeting that had never taken place. He spoke with confidence and specificity, creating an entire alternate reality to cover up whatever had actually happened during his day with Jessica. When David finished his fictional account of the retreat, Sarah looked directly into his eyes and asked, "How was Jessica's contribution to the discussion?" "Oh, she was excellent as always," David replied smoothly. "She really has a gift for seeing the big picture while keeping track of important details." Sarah felt sick. Not only was David lying about where he had been, but he was continuing to elaborate on the lie even when given opportunities to tell the truth. The man she had married would never have been capable of such sustained deception, but the man sitting across from her seemed to find it effortless. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside her. She tried to remember when she had last felt truly connected to her husband, when they had last had a conversation that felt genuine and spontaneous rather than managed and calculated. The next morning, David left early for another series of meetings, this time specifying that he would be visiting client sites across the city and might not be reachable by phone for most of the day. Sarah waited until his car disappeared around the corner before making a decision that would change everything. She drove to David's office building, parking where she could observe the entrance without being easily noticed. If David was actually visiting client sites, his car would not be in the company parking garage. If he was lying again, she would know within minutes. David's BMW was parked in his assigned space, exactly where it would be on any normal workday. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to do with this information. She could confront David directly, but his response to her question about the retreat had proven that he was capable of lying smoothly and convincingly. She could try to catch him in another lie, but that felt manipulative and exhausting. Instead, Sarah decided to trust her instincts and start paying closer attention to the details of David's behavior. If he was hiding something significant, eventually he would make a mistake that would reveal the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah began to notice patterns that she had previously overlooked or dismissed. David's phone was never left unattended, even for the few minutes it took him to shower or take out the trash. His credit card statements, which used to arrive by mail, had been switched to electronic delivery that only David could access. His work clothes occasionally smelled like perfume that was definitely not Sarah's brand, and his explanations for these scents became increasingly creative. Most troubling was the change in David's attitude toward the pregnancy. Where he had once been excited about doctor's appointments and baby preparations, he now seemed to view her growing belly as an inconvenience that complicated his schedule. When Sarah suggested they start interviewing pediatricians or tour the hospital's maternity ward, David claimed he was too busy with work to focus on such preparations. "We'll have plenty of time to figure all that out after the baby's born," David said dismissively when Sarah brought up their childbirth class schedule. "Right now, I need to focus on making sure we have the financial security to support a family." The response would have been reasonable if Mitchell Tech Solutions were struggling financially. But according to everything Sarah knew about the company's performance, business had never been better. David regularly mentioned new contracts, expanded services, and growing revenue in his conversations with clients and colleagues. If the company was thriving and David was as successful as he appeared to be, why was he so stressed about financial security? And why did preparations for their first child feel like burdens rather than exciting milestones? The answers to these questions would soon become clear in the most devastating way possible. But during those confusing weeks of her third trimester, Sarah was still hoping that her growing suspicions were the product of pregnancy hormones and misunderstood situations, rather than evidence of a deeper betrayal. She had no way of knowing that David's deception went far beyond simple infidelity, or that Jessica Torres was not just his mistress, but his partner in crimes that would eventually destroy everything they had built together. The beautiful life Sarah thought she was protecting was already crumbling, and the worst revelations were still to come. The truth revealed itself on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 3 weeks before Sarah's due date, in a way that was both accidental and inevitable. Sarah had been experiencing what her doctor described as false labor contractions, intense enough to be concerning, but not regular enough to indicate actual labor. David had driven her to the hospital at 2 in the morning, where they spent 4 hours in the maternity ward before being told that everything was normal and they could go home. During the hospital visit, David had been attentive and supportive, holding Sarah's hand during contractions and asking thoughtful questions about what they should watch for in the coming weeks. For a few hours, Sarah felt like she was seeing glimpses of the man she had married, the one who had once made her feel like the most important person in his world. But by Tuesday afternoon, David was back to his new normal of constant phone calls, urgent emails, and mysterious meetings that could not be delayed or rescheduled. When Sarah suggested they use the false alarm as a motivation to finish preparing the baby's room, David claimed he had an emergency client situation that required his immediate attention. "I'll help you this weekend," David promised as he gathered his laptop and car keys. "This client is threatening to cancel their contract, and I need to do some damage control before we lose the account." Sarah watched him leave, noting that he seemed more energized than stressed about the supposed emergency. In the past, client crises had made David tense and focused. This situation seemed to make him almost excited, as if he were looking forward to resolving whatever problem had allegedly arisen. After David left, Sarah tried to rest as her doctor had recommended, but the false contractions had left her feeling restless and anxious, and she found it impossible to sleep during the day. Instead, she decided to tackle some small organizational tasks that would help her feel more prepared for the baby's arrival. While organizing paperwork in David's home office, Sarah came across a folder that had been left on his desk, partially hidden under a stack of trade magazines. The folder was labeled Jessica Personal in David's handwriting, which immediately caught Sarah's attention. Sarah stared at the folder for several minutes, her heart pounding as she debated whether to look inside. She had never snooped through David's personal belongings before, and violating his privacy felt like crossing a line that would be difficult to uncross. But the folder's label seemed to mock her growing suspicions. Why would David have a folder labeled Jessica Personal unless their relationship had evolved beyond strictly professional boundaries? And why would such a folder be in his home office rather than at work where it belonged? Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands, expecting to find personnel files or performance evaluations that David might have brought home to review. Instead, she found copies of emails, printed photographs, and handwritten notes that painted a picture of a relationship that was anything but professional. The emails dated back 4 months, beginning with routine work correspondence, but quickly evolving into personal exchanges that became increasingly intimate. Jessica's messages revealed a woman who was completely confident in her power over David, writing about their future together as if Sarah simply did not exist. "I can't wait until we can stop sneaking around," Jessica had written in an email from 3 weeks earlier. "I know the timing is complicated with the baby coming, but we both know this is what we want. You deserve to be with someone who understands your ambition and can support your vision for the future." David's responses were even more devastating. He wrote about feeling trapped in a marriage that no longer served his needs, about how the pregnancy had been an unfortunate complication that would need to be handled carefully to minimize damage to his reputation and financial position. In one particularly cruel message, David had described Sarah as sweet but limited, someone who had been a suitable partner for the early stages of his career, but who lacked the sophistication and drive necessary for the next phase of his life. "Jessica brings out the best in me," David had written. "She challenges me intellectually and supports my growth in ways that Sarah never could. I know it's difficult to be patient, but once the baby situation is resolved, we can start building the life we both want." Sarah read through email after email, each one driving the knife of betrayal deeper into her heart. But the most devastating discovery was a detailed timeline David had created, outlining his plans for transitioning from his marriage to Sarah to a public relationship with Jessica. According to the timeline, David intended to wait until after the baby was born, and Sarah had recovered from childbirth before filing for divorce. He had already consulted with attorneys about strategies for minimizing alimony payments and maintaining control of his business assets. He had researched custody arrangements that would give him legal rights to the child while limiting his day-to-day responsibilities. Most shocking of all, David had planned to announce his relationship with Jessica at the company's annual charity gala in December, just 2 weeks after Sarah's due date. The gala would provide a public platform for introducing Jessica as his new partner, both personally and professionally, while positioning the transition as a positive step forward for the company. The timeline included detailed notes about public relations strategies, talking points for difficult conversations, and financial arrangements that would protect David's interests while minimizing negative publicity. It was not the plan of a man who had fallen into an affair. It was the calculated strategy of someone who had been systematically dismantling his marriage while presenting himself as a devoted husband. Sarah sat in David's office chair, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, feeling like her entire world was collapsing around her. The man she had loved and trusted for 6 years had been lying to her face for months while planning to discard her like an unwanted business asset. But even in her devastation, Sarah realized that the emails revealed something even more disturbing than infidelity. Mixed in with the personal correspondence were business documents that made no sense, invoices for services that had never been provided, expense reports for trips that had never happened, and financial transfers to accounts she did not recognize. One email chain between David and Jessica discussed the need to clean up the books before the end of the fiscal year and to make sure that certain transactions were properly documented to avoid scrutiny from auditors. Another exchange referenced offshore accounts and shell companies that were supposedly being used for legitimate tax optimization strategies. Sarah had enough business education to recognize that these discussions sounded like evidence of financial fraud rather than standard business practices. David and Jessica were not just having an affair, they were apparently collaborating on criminal activities that put the entire company at risk. The realization that David's betrayal extended beyond their marriage to potentially criminal behavior left Sarah feeling physically sick. She rushed to the bathroom, where she threw up repeatedly while trying to process the full scope of what she had discovered. When the nausea finally subsided, Sarah returned to David's office and carefully photographed every document in the folder with her phone. She then replaced everything exactly as she had found it, making sure that David would have no reason to suspect she had discovered his secrets. But as Sarah sat in her living room that evening, waiting for David to return home with whatever lies he had prepared to explain his day, she realized that her life had changed irrevocably. The man she had married was either gone or had never existed in the first place. The future she had imagined for their family was built on deceptions that went far beyond simple adultery. When David finally came home that night, bringing flowers and talking enthusiastically about the client crisis he had supposedly resolved, Sarah listened to his elaborate fiction with new understanding. This was not a man who had made mistakes or been led astray by temptation. This was someone who was fundamentally dishonest, capable of sustained deception about matters that affected not only his wife, but potentially hundreds of innocent people. Sarah went to bed that night knowing that her marriage was over, but not yet understanding how devastating the consequences would be. She was about to give birth to the child of a man who saw her as an obstacle to be managed and their baby as a complication to be resolved. The perfect life she thought she had been building was revealed as an elaborate lie, and the worst humiliation was still to come. Sarah spent 3 sleepless nights planning what she would say to David when she finally confronted him about Jessica and the evidence she had discovered in his office. She rehearsed different approaches, imagining how he might respond and how she could maintain her composure regardless of what he said. Part of her hope that David would have a reasonable explanation for everything she had found, that somehow the emails and timeline could be interpreted in a way that would preserve their marriage and their future together. But a larger part of Sarah already knew that no explanation could adequately account for the systematic deception she had uncovered. On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after discovering the folder, Sarah decided the time had come to force the confrontation she had been dreading. David was in an unusually good mood, having apparently secured a major new contract that day. He had brought home champagne, non-alcoholic for Sarah, and seemed more relaxed than he had been in months. After dinner, as David settled into his favorite chair with a glass of wine and his laptop, Sarah took a deep breath and walked into the room where her marriage would effectively end. "David, we need to talk about Jessica," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. David looked up from his laptop with an expression of mild curiosity, as if Sarah had mentioned wanting to discuss the weather or their weekend plans. "What about Jessica?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes suddenly alert. "I know about your affair," Sarah said simply. "I know about your plans to leave me after the baby is born. I know about the timeline you created and the things you wrote about me in your emails." For a moment, David's face went completely blank, as if he were processing an unexpected software error. Then his expression shifted through several rapid changes: surprise, calculation, and finally a kind of cold assessment that Sarah had never seen before. "I see," David said, closing his laptop and setting it aside. "How long have you known?" The question was not what Sarah had expected. She had anticipated denials, explanations, or at least some expression of remorse. Instead, David seemed to be treating her discovery as a logistical problem that required strategic thinking. "Does it matter?" Sarah asked. "It matters because I need to understand how this conversation is going to proceed," David replied. "Are you planning to make this difficult, or can we handle this like adults?" Sarah stared at her husband in disbelief. Even now, faced with undeniable evidence of his betrayal, David was not apologizing or expressing regret. He was trying to manage the situation like a business negotiation. "Make this difficult?" Sarah repeated. "David, you've been planning to abandon your pregnant wife, and you're asking if I'm going to make it difficult?" "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm making a rational decision about my future based on what's best for everyone involved." "Everyone involved? What about what's best for your child?" David's expression softened slightly, as if he were dealing with someone who did not understand basic economics. "Sarah, I've thought about this very carefully. The child will be better off in the long run with parents who are honest about their situation rather than trapped in a marriage that isn't working. I'll provide financial support and maintain a relationship with the baby, but continuing this charade isn't fair to any of us." The clinical way David discussed their child, referring to the baby as the child and their marriage as a charade, made Sarah feel like she was talking to a stranger. This was not the man who had cried during their wedding vows or who had spent hours discussing baby names and nursery decorations. "When did you stop loving me?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about when and how such a fundamental change had occurred. David considered the question seriously, as if he were being asked to analyze a business decision. "I don't think I stopped loving you," he said finally. "I think we both outgrew what we had together. You're a good person, Sarah, but we want different things now. Jessica and I are more compatible in terms of our goals and ambitions." "Our goals and ambitions?" "David, I gave up my career to support your business and start our family. How is that incompatible with your goals?" "That's exactly what I mean," David said, his voice taking on a tone of patient explanation. "You were content to give up your career and focus on domestic life. That worked when the company was smaller, but I need a partner who can grow with me as my responsibilities expand." Sarah felt a flash of anger that cut through her shock and hurt. "So you decided to replace me without bothering to discuss it? You made plans to divorce me and marry your assistant without giving me any opportunity to address your concerns? Sarah, be honest. If I had told you 6 months ago that I was feeling disconnected from our marriage, what would you have done? You would have wanted to go to counseling, talk about our feelings, try to fix something that was fundamentally broken. That's not who I am anymore." The casual dismissal of any effort to save their marriage was perhaps the most devastating thing David had said yet. He was not even pretending that their relationship had value worth preserving. "What about Jessica?" Sarah asked. "How long has this been going on?" "We developed feelings for each other over the past several months," David said, as if describing a merger between two companies. "We tried to maintain professional boundaries, but eventually we realized that we were better suited for each other than our current situations allowed." "Are you in love with her?" David's face lit up for the first time during their conversation, and Sarah saw a glimpse of the passion and enthusiasm that had once been directed toward her. "Yes," David said simply. "Jessica understands who I'm becoming in ways that you never could. She supports my vision for the future and wants to build something significant together." The confirmation hurt more than Sarah had expected, even though she had already seen the evidence in David's emails. Hearing him say the words out loud made the betrayal feel final and irreversible. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we handle this transition as smoothly as possible," David said, back to his businesslike tone. "I'll move out this weekend. We'll file for divorce after the baby is born, and you've had time to recover. I'll provide generous financial support for both you and the child, and we'll work out custody arrangements that are fair to everyone." "Generous financial support?" "David, I gave up my career for this marriage. I have no income, no recent work experience, and I'm about to have a baby. How exactly do you expect me to support myself? You're a smart, capable woman, Sarah. You'll figure it out. And like I said, I'll provide support during the transition. The dismissive way David discussed her future, as if her concerns were minor details to be resolved later, finally pushed Sarah past the point of rational conversation. You bastard, she said, her voice rising. You made me quit my job, isolated me from my colleagues, and planned my entire life around supporting your career. Now you want to discard me like I'm some kind of business asset that's no longer useful? Keep your voice down, David said, glancing toward the windows as if he were concerned about neighbors overhearing. Getting emotional isn't going to change anything. Emotional? David, you're destroying our family and you're upset that I'm getting emotional? I'm not destroying anything, Sarah. I'm being honest about a situation that wasn't working. Would you prefer that I continue lying to you indefinitely? The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the impossible choice David was presenting. Sarah could either accept his betrayal as inevitable or be criticized for wanting him to continue deceiving her. I would have preferred that you talk to me about your concerns before making unilateral decisions about our future, Sarah said. I would have preferred that you treat me like a partner rather than an obstacle. And I would have preferred that you grow with me instead of being content with mediocrity, David replied. But we don't always get what we want. Key. The conversation continued for another hour, but it was clear that David had already made his decisions and saw no point in further discussion. He was not interested in saving their marriage, addressing Sarah's concerns, or even acknowledging that his behavior had been cruel and deceptive. When David finally went upstairs to pack a bag for the weekend, Sarah sat alone in their living room, 8 months pregnant and facing the complete collapse of everything she had built her life around. But even in her devastation, Sarah sensed that David's coldness and calculation suggested something darker than simple infidelity. The man who could plan the destruction of his family with such clinical detachment was capable of other forms of betrayal as well. The business documents she had seen in David's folder suddenly took on new significance. If David could lie so systematically about his personal life, what else might he be lying about? Sarah was about to discover that David's capacity for deception went far beyond marital infidelity, and that the personal betrayal she was experiencing was only one part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior that would eventually destroy him completely. The weekend after confronting David about his affair, Sarah found herself alone in the house for the first time in months. David had moved into a downtown apartment that he claimed was temporary, though Sarah suspected he was actually moving in with Jessica. The silence that filled their home was both devastating and liberating. For months, Sarah had been walking on eggshells around David's increasingly unpredictable moods and mysterious schedule. Now, at least, she did not have to pretend that everything was normal while her husband planned her replacement. But the quiet also gave Sarah too much time to think about the business documents she had seen mixed in with David's personal correspondence with Jessica. The references to offshore accounts, shell companies, and cleaning up the books kept replaying in her mind, especially now that she understood the full extent of David's capacity for deception. On Sunday afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She called her college friend Michael Brooks, who had become an investigative journalist for the Columbus Dispatch after graduating with a degree in journalism and political science. Sarah and Michael had maintained a casual friendship over the years, occasionally meeting for coffee when their schedules allowed. Michael had covered several stories about Columbus's business community, and Sarah remembered him mentioning that he specialized in corporate corruption and white-collar crime. Sarah? Michael sounded surprised to hear from her. How are you? I heard through the grapevine that David's company has been doing really well. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about, Sarah said. I think there might be some things about Mitchell Tech Solutions that would interest you professionally. They arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop in Clintonville, a neighborhood far enough from downtown that they were unlikely to encounter anyone from David's business circle. When Sarah arrived at the coffee shop, she was carrying a folder containing copies of all the documents she had photographed from David's office. Michael was already waiting at a corner table, looking concerned but curious about what Sarah wanted to discuss. Before we start, Sarah said, settling into her chair with some difficulty due to her advanced pregnancy, I need to tell you that David and I are getting divorced. He's been having an affair with his assistant, and I discovered some things that I think you should know about. Ma Michael's expression grew more serious. I'm sorry to hear about your marriage, Sarah. That must be incredibly difficult, especially with the baby coming. Thank you, but that's not really why I called you. Michael, I think David and his assistant have been embezzling money from the company. I found documents that suggest they've been creating fake invoices, hiding money in offshore accounts, and lying to investors about the company's financial condition. Sarah opened her folder and spread copies of the most damning documents across the table. Michael examined them carefully, his journalistic instincts clearly engaged as he studied the financial records and email exchanges. Sarah, this is serious, Michael said after reviewing several pages. If these documents are authentic, we're not talking about simple marital infidelity. This looks like fraud, embezzlement, and possibly securities violations. I know it's serious. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I don't know what to do with this information, but I can't just ignore it. Michael continued studying the documents, occasionally asking Sarah questions about dates, context, and how she had obtained the materials. His questions were professional and methodical, and Sarah could see him shifting from friend mode to investigative reporter mode. Can you tell me more about Jessica Torres? Michael asked. How long has she been working for the company, and what's her role in these activities? Sarah shared everything she knew about Jessica's background, her rapid rise within the company, and her apparent involvement in both the personal affair and the business irregularities. As she talked, Michael took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions that revealed his understanding of financial crime. After an hour of discussion, Michael sat back in his chair and looked directly at Sarah. I believe these documents are genuine, and I think they represent evidence of significant criminal activity, he said. But I need to ask you a difficult question. Are you sure you want to pursue this? Once I start investigating David's business practices, there's no controlling where the story goes or how it affects your life. Sarah had been thinking about this question since she first discovered the documents. She knew that exposing David's crimes would make their divorce more complicated and potentially put her in danger if David realized she was the source of the information. But she also thought about the innocent people who might be affected by David's fraud. Employees whose jobs depended on the company's legitimate success, investors who had trusted David with their money, and clients who believed they were dealing with an honest business. I can't protect David's crimes just because he's my husband, Sarah said. If he's stealing from people, they have a right to know. Michael nodded approvingly. That's the right answer, but it's going to be difficult. David will probably figure out that you're the source of the information, and he won't be happy about it. David's already destroying my life, Sarah replied. At least this way, some good might come from it. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and Michael worked together to verify the information she had provided and to gather additional evidence of David's criminal activities. Michael had contacts in law enforcement and the financial industry who could help authenticate documents and explain the legal significance of various transactions. What they discovered was worse than Sarah had initially suspected. David's fraudulent activities went back almost 3 years and involved millions of dollars stolen from employee pension funds, investor contributions, and client accounts. Jessica had not just been David's accomplice. She had been instrumental in creating the elaborate schemes used to hide the theft. The company's impressive growth and profitability were largely fictional, supported by falsified financial reports and money that had been diverted from legitimate business operations. David had used the stolen funds to finance his luxurious lifestyle, including the expensive house, cars, and vacations that Sarah had assumed were the rewards of legitimate business success. Michael also discovered that David and Jessica were planning to disappear with several $1,000,000 in stolen money immediately after the annual charity gala, where David intended to announce their engagement. Their timeline for divorcing Sarah and going public with their relationship was actually a cover for an exit strategy that would allow them to flee the country before their crimes were discovered. Sarah, this is bigger than I initially thought, Michael told her during one of their meetings. David isn't just cheating on you and embezzling money. He's planning to abandon the company entirely and leave dozens of employees and investors holding the bag. The revelation that David was planning to destroy the livelihoods of innocent people gave Sarah's mission a sense of urgency that went far beyond personal revenge. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had trusted David Mitchell and would be devastated by his betrayal. But Sarah also realized that time was running out. The charity gala was less than 2 weeks away, and if David and Jessica executed their plan successfully, they would disappear with millions of dollars while leaving behind a trail of financial ruin. Working with Michael and his contacts in law enforcement, Sarah began providing evidence to federal investigators who had been looking into similar fraud schemes at other companies. The FBI was very interested in David's activities, especially when they learned about the planned escape after the gala. But building a federal case would take time, and Sarah was due to give birth at any moment. The stress of the investigation, combined with the emotional trauma of her collapsing marriage, was taking a physical toll that worried her doctor. As Sarah entered her final weeks of pregnancy, she found herself in the surreal position of preparing for childbirth, while simultaneously helping to build a criminal case against her baby's father. The man who should have been supporting her through the most vulnerable time of her life was instead planning to abandon her and steal millions of dollars from innocent people. But Sarah had found something she had not expected in the midst of her personal devastation, a sense of purpose and moral clarity that gave her strength she had not known she possessed. She was no longer just David Mitchell's pregnant wife. She was a whistleblower fighting to protect innocent victims from a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. The final confrontation was approaching, and Sarah was ready to ensure that David faced consequences for all of his crimes, not just the personal betrayal that had destroyed their marriage. The Mitchell Tech Solutions annual charity gala was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 2 weeks after Sarah's due date. As the event approached, Sarah found herself in the bizarre position of watching her estranged husband prepare for what was essentially a public celebration of his crimes. David had been calling her regularly to discuss logistics for the gala, speaking as if they were still a married couple planning to attend together. His ability to compartmentalize his deception was so complete that he seemed genuinely confused when Sarah expressed reluctance about participating in an event where he planned to announce his engagement to another woman. "Sarah, this is important for the company," David said during one of their phone conversations. "A lot of major clients and investors will be there, and it would look strange if you weren't present. People would ask questions." "Let them ask questions, David. I'm not going to pretend everything is fine just to protect your reputation." "Think about what's best for the baby," David replied, as if their child would somehow benefit from Sarah's public humiliation. "Do you really want your son or daughter to grow up knowing that their mother caused a scene at their father's most important business event?" The manipulation was so transparent that Sarah almost laughed. David was asking her to facilitate her own betrayal while framing his request as concern for their unborn child. But Sarah had her own reasons for wanting to attend the gala. Working with Michael and the federal investigators, she had learned that the event would provide the perfect opportunity to expose David's crimes in front of all the people he had been deceiving. The FBI had been building their case for 3 weeks, but they needed more time to ensure that all of David's co-conspirators could be arrested simultaneously. If David and Jessica were allowed to execute their plan to flee the country after the gala, other members of their network might escape prosecution. Sarah's presence at the gala would serve multiple purposes. She could provide real-time intelligence about David and Jessica's behavior, help identify other potential conspirators, and serve as a witness to any incriminating statements they might make. More importantly, Sarah had decided that she deserved to be present when David's world collapsed. After months of lies, manipulation, and betrayal, she wanted to look David in the eye when he realized that his elaborate deceptions had been discovered. On December 3rd, exactly 11 days before the gala, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Emma Catherine Mitchell arrived after 6 hours of labor, weighing 7 pounds and 8 ounces, with dark hair and eyes that reminded Sarah of her own childhood photographs. David was present for the birth, playing the role of supportive husband and father with a performance that would have been convincing to anyone who did not know the truth about his character. He held Sarah's hand during contractions, took photos of Emma's first moments, and spoke emotionally about becoming a father. But even in the delivery room, David's phone buzzed constantly with messages that he checked whenever he thought Sarah was not paying attention. Several times, Sarah caught glimpses of Jessica's name on his phone screen, suggesting that even during his daughter's birth, David was coordinating with his criminal partner. The contrast between David's public persona as a devoted family man and his private reality as someone planning to abandon his newborn daughter was so stark that Sarah felt like she was watching a psychological thriller unfold in real time. During Sarah's 3-day hospital stay, David maintained his facade of concern and excitement about fatherhood. He brought flowers, helped with feeding schedules, and spoke enthusiastically about Emma's future. But Sarah noticed that he never discussed long-term plans or made commitments that extended beyond the immediate present. When they brought Emma home from the hospital, David insisted on hiring a night nurse to help with feedings and sleep schedules. He claimed the expense was justified because Sarah needed rest to recover from childbirth, but Sarah suspected the real reason was that he wanted to maintain his freedom to come and go without having to explain his schedule. The night nurse, Mrs. Anderson, was a kind woman in her 60s who had been caring for newborns for over 30 years. She immediately noticed the tension between Sarah and David, though she was too professional to comment directly on their relationship dynamics. "Your husband seems very focused on his work," Mrs. Anderson observed diplomatically after David left for another late-night meeting. "Some men have difficulty adjusting to the responsibilities of parenthood." Sarah appreciated Mrs. Anderson's tact, but she knew that David's behavior had nothing to do with normal adjustment difficulties. He was not struggling to balance work and family. He was preparing to abandon both. As the gala approached, David's excitement became increasingly obvious. He spent hours on phone calls with event planners, discussed menu selections and floral arrangements with the intensity of someone planning a wedding, and bought a new tuxedo for the occasion. Jessica had also ramped up her involvement in gala preparations, though she continued to avoid any direct contact with Sarah. When David brought documents home to review, Sarah occasionally glimpsed Jessica's handwriting on notes about seating arrangements, speaker schedules, and media coverage. The anticipation in David's behavior confirmed what Sarah had learned from the federal investigation. The gala was not just an opportunity to announce his engagement to Jessica, but the final step in their plan to steal millions of dollars and disappear together. 3 days before the gala, Michael called Sarah with an update on the federal investigation. "The FBI is ready to move," he told her. "They have enough evidence to arrest David and Jessica, and they've identified the offshore accounts where the stolen money is being held. But they want to wait until after the gala to make the arrests." "Why wait?" Sarah asked. "Because David and Jessica are planning to transfer the remaining stolen funds on the night of the gala, using the event as cover for their final transactions. If the FBI moves too early, they might not be able to recover all the money or arrest all the co-conspirators." Sarah understood the strategic reasoning, but the delay meant she would have to attend the gala, knowing that David was about to publicly humiliate her while simultaneously completing his theft of millions of dollars. "Will I be safe?" Sarah asked. "If David realizes that I'm the source of the information, he might try to stop me from interfering with his plans." "You'll have protection," Michael assured her. "There will be undercover agents at the gala, and they'll be watching David and Jessica closely. But Sarah, are you sure you want to go through with this? You just had a baby, and this is going to be incredibly stressful." Sarah looked at Emma sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, thinking about the future she wanted to build for her daughter. She wanted Emma to grow up knowing that her mother had fought for justice, even when it was difficult and dangerous. "I'm sure," Sarah said. "I want to be there when David faces the consequences of his choices." The final preparations were now complete. In 3 days, Sarah would attend the charity gala, where her husband planned to announce his engagement to his criminal partner while completing one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in Ohio history. But David had no idea that his elaborate deceptions had been discovered, or that the woman he had betrayed and discarded was about to ensure that he faced justice for all of his crimes. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose years of lies and ensure that dozens of innocent victims would finally see justice served. The Grand Columbus Hotel Ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland for the Mitchell Tech Solutions annual charity gala. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables decorated with white roses and gold accents, while a string quartet provided elegant background music for the cocktail hour that preceded dinner. Sarah arrived at 7 p.m., exactly on schedule, wearing a navy blue dress that she had chosen specifically because it made her feel confident and strong. She had spent 2 hours getting ready, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she needed to project strength and composure for what was about to unfold. Emma was at home with Mrs. Anderson, safe and far away from the chaos that would soon erupt. Sarah had fed her daughter before leaving and given detailed instructions about bedtime routines, though she suspected she might not be home until very late. The FBI agents who would be providing security were already in position, disguised as catering staff, hotel employees, and even guests at nearby tables. Michael was present as a credentialed journalist covering the event for the Columbus Dispatch, though his real purpose was to document whatever happened when David's crimes were finally exposed. As Sarah entered the ballroom, she immediately spotted David near the bar, surrounded by clients and investors who were congratulating him on another successful year. He looked handsome and confident in his new tuxedo, playing the role of successful CEO with the same polished performance he had perfected over years of practice. Jessica was at David's side, wearing a stunning red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The diamond engagement ring on her left hand caught the light from the chandeliers, announcing to everyone present that she was no longer just David's assistant, but his fiancée. The sight of them together, presenting themselves as a legitimate couple while Sarah stood alone across the room, should have been devastating. But instead of feeling humiliated or defeated, Sarah felt calm and focused. She knew something that David and Jessica did not. Their perfect evening was about to become their worst nightmare. Several people approached Sarah during the cocktail hour, expressing surprise at seeing her so soon after giving birth and offering congratulations on Emma's arrival. Sarah accepted their kind words graciously while keeping one eye on David and Jessica, monitoring their interactions and watching for signs that they suspected anything unusual. At 8 o'clock, guests were invited to take their seats for dinner. Sarah had been assigned to a table near the front of the room, close enough to the head table to observe David and Jessica clearly, but far enough away to avoid direct confrontation during the meal. The dinner conversation at Sarah's table was polite, but awkward. Her table mates seemed unsure how to address the obvious tension between Sarah and David, especially given the prominent display of Jessica's engagement ring. Several people made carefully neutral comments about the charity being supported by the gala, while studiously avoiding any mention of personal relationships. During the main course, David stood to make his opening remarks as CEO and host of the event. His speech began with standard thank yous to sponsors and attendees, followed by updates on the company's growth and success over the past year. Mitchell Tech Solutions has exceeded all of our growth projections, David announced, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. We've expanded our client base by 40%, increased revenue by 60%, and created jobs for dozens of talented professionals. Sarah listened to David's fabricated success story with grim satisfaction. Everything he was claiming about the company's performance was based on stolen money and falsified records that would soon be exposed. The audience was applauding achievements that did not actually exist. But tonight is about more than celebrating our business success, David continued, his tone becoming more personal. Tonight is about acknowledging the people who make that success possible and about sharing some exciting news about the future of our company. Sarah's heart rate increased as David approached the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. As many of you know, I've been working closely with an exceptional woman over the past year, David said, his eyes finding Jessica at the head table. Jessica Torres has been instrumental in our company's growth, and I'm thrilled to announce that she has agreed to become my partner in business and in life. The ballroom erupted in applause and surprised murmurs as Jessica stood and joined David at the podium. Her engagement ring sparkled under the lights as she waved to the crowd, basking in the attention and approval of Columbus's business elite. Jessica and I are engaged to be married, David announced, his arm around Jessica's waist. We're excited to build a future together and to continue growing Mitchell Tech Solutions into one of the region's premier technology companies. The applause continued, though Sarah noticed several guests glancing in her direction with expressions of confusion and concern. The public announcement of David's engagement while his wife sat in the audience was so brazen that even people who did not know the full story seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but David was not finished. As the applause died down, he continued with the speech that would seal his fate. Jessica and I have big plans for the future, David said, his confidence seeming to grow with each word. We'll be expanding our operations internationally, developing new partnerships in emerging markets, and taking advantage of opportunities that will allow us to compete on a global scale. What David did not know was that every word of his speech was being recorded by multiple FBI agents, and that his promises about international expansion and emerging market opportunities matched exactly the cover story he and Jessica had created for their plan to flee the country with stolen money. As David and Jessica returned to their seats amid continued applause, Sarah felt her phone vibrate with a text message from Michael. "It's happening, 15 minutes." Sarah looked around the ballroom with new eyes, knowing that in 15 minutes, federal agents would begin making arrests that would expose one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in Ohio history. The elegant party would become a crime scene, and David's moment of triumph would become the beginning of his complete downfall. But first, Sarah had one final act to perform in the drama that had consumed her life for the past 6 months. She stood up from her table and began walking toward the head table, where David and Jessica were accepting congratulations from other guests. It was time for the confrontation she had been planning since the night she discovered David's betrayal. And this time, Sarah would not be the victim who suffered in silence while others destroyed her life. Sarah's approach to the head table did not go unnoticed. Conversations quieted as guests turned to watch the pregnant woman who had given birth just 12 days earlier, walking with deliberate purpose toward her husband and his newly announced fiancé. David saw Sarah coming, and his expression shifted from celebratory confidence to something that might have been concern or calculation. Jessica followed David's gaze and spotted Sarah moving through the crowd, her face immediately hardening into the kind of cold hostility that revealed her true character. When Sarah reached the head table, she positioned herself directly in front of David and Jessica, close enough that their conversation could be heard by nearby guests, but not so close as to seem confrontational or unstable. "Congratulations on your engagement," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. "I hope you'll be very happy together." The unexpected graciousness of Sarah's comment seemed to catch both David and Jessica off guard. They had probably expected tears, accusations, or some kind of dramatic scene that would make Sarah look unstable and vindictive. Instead, Sarah projected calm dignity that made David's public betrayal look even more cruel and unnecessary. Several guests were watching the exchange with obvious discomfort, and Sarah could see people whispering to each other about the remarkable composure she was displaying. "Thank you, Sarah," David replied carefully. "I hope we can handle this transition in a way that's best for everyone, especially Emma." The reference to their newborn daughter, spoken as if Emma's welfare were a shared priority rather than something David was actively undermining, pushed Sarah past the point of polite conversation. "Actually, David, I wanted to ask you about something," Sarah said, maintaining her calm tone while moving into more dangerous territory. "I've been reviewing some of the company's financial documents, and I noticed some interesting patterns in your international business development initiatives." David's face went pale. The phrase international business development initiatives was the exact terminology he and Jessica had used in their emails to describe their money laundering and escape plans. "I don't think this is the appropriate time or place to discuss business matters," David said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Oh, but I think it is," Sarah replied. "After all, you just announced plans to expand internationally and develop partnerships in emerging markets. I'm sure our guests would be interested to hear more details about those exciting opportunities." Jessica stepped closer to David, her mask of civilized behavior beginning to slip as she realized that Sarah might know more than she was revealing. "Sarah, you're making everyone uncomfortable," Jessica said, her voice carrying a warning that might have intimidated Sarah 6 months earlier. "This is supposed to be a celebration, not a business meeting." "You're right, Jessica. This is a celebration," Sarah agreed. "We're celebrating new partnerships, international opportunities, and the kind of innovative financial strategies that have made Mitchell Tech Solutions so successful." Each phrase Sarah used had specific meaning in the context of David and Jessica's criminal activities, and both of them clearly understood that Sarah was not making casual conversation about legitimate business practices. "Sarah, I think you should sit down," David said, his attempt at authoritative control undermined by the sweat that was beginning to form on his forehead, despite the ballroom's comfortable temperature. "Actually, I think I'll stand," Sarah replied. "I want to make sure everyone can hear what I have to say about the exciting developments at Mitchell Tech Solutions." The conversation was attracting more attention now, with guests at nearby tables turning their chairs to watch the drama unfold. Sarah could see Michael in her peripheral vision, positioned to document whatever happened next, and she knew that FBI agents were monitoring the situation from multiple locations around the ballroom. You know, Jessica, Sarah continued, addressing David's fiancée directly, I'm curious about your role in these international expansion plans. David's told me so much about your contributions to the company's financial strategies. Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. The woman who had been basking in congratulations and admiration just minutes earlier now looked like someone who realized she was walking into a trap. I don't know what you're talking about, Jessica said, but her voice carried none of the confidence she had displayed earlier in the evening. Of course you do, Sarah replied. You've been instrumental in developing the offshore partnerships, managing the international accounts, and coordinating the transfer protocols that have made David's expansion plans possible. The specific terminology Sarah was using made it clear to anyone with business experience that she was describing money laundering operations rather than legitimate international business development. Several guests were now paying close attention to the conversation, and some were beginning to look concerned about what they were hearing. David tried one last time to regain control of the situation. Sarah, you're obviously still emotional about our personal situation, but making wild accusations at a public event isn't going to change anything. Wild accusations? Sarah repeated. David, I'm simply asking questions about the business practices that have funded your lifestyle and made tonight's celebration possible. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before delivering the statement that would end David's criminal career. I think our guests deserve to know that the success we're celebrating tonight was built on money stolen from employee pension funds, investor accounts, and client payments that were diverted to offshore accounts controlled by you and Jessica. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Guests at nearby tables gasped and began talking excitedly among themselves. Several investors who had put money into Mitchell Tech Solutions stood up and began demanding explanations. The string quartet stopped playing as the musicians realized that something serious was happening. David's face went from pale to bright red as he realized that his carefully constructed public image was collapsing in real time. Those are serious accusations, Sarah. I hope you can prove what you're claiming. Actually, I can, Sarah replied, reaching into her purse and pulling out a thick folder. I have copies of emails, financial records, and wire transfer documentation that prove everything I've just described. Jessica lunged toward Sarah, trying to grab the folder, but Sarah stepped back quickly enough to avoid her reach. The sudden movement caused Jessica to stumble, and she had to grab David's arm to keep from falling. You crazy bitch, Jessica hissed, all pretense of civility abandoned. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, Sarah replied. I'm exposing criminals who have been stealing from innocent people while pretending to be respectable business leaders. The commotion had attracted the attention of hotel security, but before they could intervene, men in suits began appearing from various locations around the ballroom. Sarah recognized them as the FBI agents who had been providing security, and she knew that the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. David Mitchell and Jessica Torres, one of the agents announced, displaying his badge. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The final act of David's criminal career was unfolding exactly as Sarah had hoped it would, in front of everyone he had been deceiving, and with the evidence of his crimes displayed for all to see. But the confrontation was not over yet. As federal agents moved to place handcuffs on David and Jessica, the full extent of their desperation and viciousness would be revealed in a way that no one in the ballroom could have anticipated. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of flashing cameras, shouted questions, and the systematic dismantling of David Mitchell's carefully constructed empire. FBI agents moved through the ballroom with practiced efficiency, securing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and coordinating with hotel security to manage the crowd of shocked guests. David and Jessica were led away in handcuffs, but not before the entire ballroom had witnessed their arrest and heard the charges being read aloud. The images of Columbus's golden couple being escorted through the elegant hotel lobby would dominate local news coverage for weeks to come. Sarah remained calm throughout the chaos, answering questions from federal agents and providing additional documentation that would support their case. The folders she had brought to the gala contained copies of the most damaging evidence, but she had turned over the original documents to the FBI weeks earlier. Michael approached Sarah as the initial commotion began to settle, his notebook full of quotes and observations that would form the basis of his front-page story for the next day's newspaper. "How are you holding up?" he asked, genuinely concerned about Sarah's emotional state after such an intense confrontation. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, and she was surprised to realize that she meant it. "Actually, I feel better than I have in months. It's over, Michael. David can't hurt anyone else now." The relief in Sarah's voice was obvious, and Michael could see that the confrontation had been cathartic rather than traumatic for her. She had spent months feeling powerless and victimized, but tonight she had taken control of the situation and ensured that justice would be served. As guests began to leave the hotel, many stopped to speak with Sarah, expressing admiration for her courage and offering support during what they assumed would be a difficult period of adjustment. Several business leaders approached her with job offers, recognizing that someone with her intelligence and integrity would be a valuable addition to their organizations. But the most meaningful conversation of the evening came from an unlikely source: David's grandfather, who had driven up from Tennessee when he heard about the gala and the engagement announcement. "Sarah, I need to apologize to you," the elderly man said, his voice heavy with shame and regret. "I raised David to be better than this, and I failed him and you." "You didn't fail anyone, Mr. Mitchell," Sarah replied. "David made his own choices, and they weren't your responsibility." "I want you to know that you and Emma will always be family to me," he continued. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. That little girl is my great-granddaughter, and I intend to be part of her life if you'll allow it." The conversation with David's grandfather reminded Sarah that not everyone connected to this situation was guilty of wrongdoing. There were innocent family members, employees, and investors who would also suffer because of David's crimes. Over the following weeks, the full scope of David and Jessica's criminal activities became clear through media coverage and federal court filings. They had stolen over $4 million from various sources, created an elaborate network of shell companies to hide the money, and planned to flee the country immediately after the gala. The investigation also revealed that their crimes had affected dozens of innocent victims. Employee pension funds had been raided to finance David's lifestyle, investor contributions had been diverted to offshore accounts, and client payments had been stolen instead of being used for promised services. But thanks to Sarah's cooperation with federal investigators, most of the stolen money was recovered before it could be transferred overseas. The employees who had lost pension contributions would eventually receive compensation, and investors would recover the majority of their losses. David and Jessica both pled guilty to multiple federal charges rather than face trial and potentially longer sentences. David received 18 years in federal prison, while Jessica received 12 years as part of a plea agreement that required her to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations. The sentencing hearing provided Sarah with one final opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their marriage and betrayed so many innocent people. She read a victim impact statement that focused not on personal grievances, but on David's abuse of trust and the harm he had caused to employees and investors. David Mitchell presented himself as a successful businessman who cared about his employees and clients, Sarah said, addressing the federal judge who would determine David's sentence. In reality, he was a criminal who stole from the people who trusted him most. His victims include not just his family, but dozens of hardworking people who believed in his integrity. David sat at the defendant's table throughout Sarah's statement, never making eye contact or showing any sign of remorse for his actions. Even facing decades in prison, he seemed to view himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control, rather than someone who had made deliberate choices to harm others. But the judge was not impressed with David's lack of accountability. In announcing the sentence, she specifically noted that David's crimes had been calculated, sustained, and devastating to numerous victims who trusted him with their financial security. As Sarah left the courthouse that day, she felt a sense of closure that had been months in the making. The man who had betrayed her trust and stolen from innocent people would spend the next 18 years in federal prison, unable to harm anyone else with his lies and manipulation. The media coverage of the trial and sentencing was extensive, but it focused primarily on the financial crimes rather than the personal betrayal that had initially motivated Sarah to expose David's activities. She was portrayed as a courageous whistleblower who had risked everything to protect innocent victims, rather than simply a scorned wife seeking revenge. This distinction was important both for Sarah's public reputation and for her own sense of identity. She had not acted out of personal vindictiveness, but out of a genuine commitment to justice and protecting others from harm. 6 months after David's sentencing, Sarah Mitchell was building a life that bore no resemblance to the fairy tale she had once believed she was living. But for the first time since discovering David's betrayal, she felt genuinely optimistic about the future she was creating for herself and Emma. The small house in Clintonville that Sarah had purchased with her share of David's asset forfeiture had become a true home in ways that the elegant Upper Arlington mansion never had. The neighborhood was diverse and welcoming, with tree-lined streets where children played safely and neighbors knew each other's names. Emma's nursery faced east, filling with morning sunlight that made even the most difficult nights feel manageable. Emma herself had grown from a tiny newborn into a bright, curious 8-month-old, with her mother's determination and her great-grandfather's gentle temperament. David's grandfather had indeed remained a constant presence in their lives, driving up from Tennessee monthly to spend weekends helping with childcare and sharing stories about his own struggles to build something meaningful from difficult circumstances. "That little girl is going to be stronger than both of us," he often told Sarah as they watched Emma explore her world with fearless enthusiasm. "She's got your backbone and enough sense not to repeat her father's mistakes." The financial settlement from David's crimes had provided Sarah with more security than she had expected. The federal government's Victim Compensation Fund, combined with civil settlements from the dissolved company, had given her enough money to buy her house outright and establish a college fund for Emma. She was not wealthy, but she was stable in ways that went far beyond simple finances. More importantly, Sarah had discovered talents and passions she had not known she possessed. The media attention following David's arrest had led to speaking opportunities at business schools, law enforcement conferences, and victim advocacy organizations. Sarah found that she had a natural ability to connect with audiences and explain complex financial crimes in terms that ordinary people could understand. "The victims of corporate fraud are not just numbers on a spreadsheet," Sarah told audiences at these events. "They're real people who trusted someone with their financial security and their future. When that trust is betrayed, the damage goes far beyond money." Her presentations were always well received, not just because of her expertise, but because of her ability to speak about traumatic experiences with wisdom rather than bitterness. Sarah had learned to separate the personal pain of David's betrayal from the broader mission of protecting others from similar harm. The speaking engagements had led to consulting work with law firms that specialized in white-collar crime defense. Sarah's unique perspective as both a victim and a whistleblower made her valuable to attorneys who needed to understand how financial crimes affected real families and communities. But Sarah's most ambitious project was her decision to return to school. She had enrolled in law school at Ohio State University, attending classes part-time while caring for Emma. Her goal was to specialize in criminal justice and victim advocacy, using her experiences to help other people navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of exposing corruption. The law school coursework was demanding, especially combined with the responsibilities of single motherhood, but Sarah consistently ranked at the top of her class. Her professors were impressed not just with her academic performance, but with her mature perspective on legal issues that many students could only understand theoretically. Sarah brings real-world experience to classroom discussions that enriches everyone's understanding, her criminal law professor wrote in a recommendation letter. She has an intuitive grasp of how legal concepts affect actual people, and her commitment to justice is both inspiring and practical. The other law students initially seemed intimidated by Sarah's story and media profile, but they quickly discovered that she was generous with her time and knowledge, always willing to help struggling classmates understand difficult concepts or navigate law school challenges. Sarah's study group had become particularly close, meeting weekly at her house where Emma would often play quietly nearby while the students discussed case law and legal theory. The other members of the group came to view Emma as something like a mascot, and several had volunteered to provide childcare during Sarah's most demanding exam periods. "Emma's going to grow up thinking law school is normal," joked Marcus, a fellow student who had become one of Sarah's closest friends. She'll probably be reading case law before she can tie her shoes. The comment made Sarah smile, but it also reflected her hope that Emma would indeed grow up with a clear understanding of justice and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. On the second anniversary of the gala that had changed everything, Sarah was asked to speak at a conference for federal prosecutors who specialized in financial crimes. The event was held in Washington, D.C., and Sarah arranged for David's grandfather to stay with Emma during her trip. The conference brought together law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and victim advocates from across the country to discuss strategies for investigating and prosecuting corporate fraud. Sarah's presentation focused on the importance of supporting whistleblowers and protecting victims throughout the legal process. When someone decides to expose corporate corruption, they're not just risking their career or their financial security, Sarah told the audience of prosecutors and investigators. They're often risking their entire sense of identity and their relationships with people they trusted. The legal system needs to understand that these are not just sources of information, but human beings who need support and protection. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by several federal prosecutors who wanted to discuss specific cases where victim testimony had been crucial to securing convictions. The conversations reinforced her belief that her experiences could be valuable in helping other people find the courage to speak up about wrongdoing. But the most meaningful part of the conference was meeting other whistleblowers who had exposed various forms of corporate corruption. Sarah realized that her story was part of a larger pattern of ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage when faced with evidence of serious wrongdoing. "We're not heroes," explained Janet, a former bank employee who had exposed a mortgage fraud scheme. "We're just people who couldn't live with staying silent when we knew innocent people were being hurt." The conversation helped Sarah understand that her decision to expose David's crimes had not been unique or particularly courageous. It had been the natural response of someone with a strong moral compass who was faced with clear evidence of harm to others. That evening, Sarah called home to check on Emma and found her daughter babbling happily to her great-grandfather, who was reading her a story about brave animals who helped their friends solve problems. "She's been asking for Mama all day," David's grandfather reported, "but she's been a perfect angel. I think she knows you're doing important work." After hanging up, Sarah walked around the National Mall in the evening light, thinking about how much her life had changed since that devastating night when she had discovered David's betrayal. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through her relationship with her husband was now building an identity based on her own values and choices. The pain of David's betrayal had never completely disappeared, but it had been transformed into something productive and meaningful. Sarah's experiences with deception and manipulation had given her insights that helped other people recognize and respond to similar situations. When Sarah returned to Columbus the next day, she found Emma taking her first tentative steps between the coffee table and the couch, with David's grandfather cheering her on from nearby. "She waited for you to come home," he said, his eyes misty with emotion. "Smart little girl knows when something important is happening." As Sarah watched her daughter explore the world with determination and curiosity, she realized that Emma was growing up with advantages that went far beyond financial security. She was being raised by a community of people who valued honesty, courage, and standing up for others. The fairy tale that Sarah had once believed in, where love and trust were automatically rewarded with happiness and security, had turned out to be an illusion. But the story she was now living, where courage and integrity led to genuine peace and meaningful work, felt real and sustainable in ways that her marriage never had. 3 years after the gala, Sarah graduated from law school with honors and immediately joined a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to victims of financial crimes. Her first case involved helping a group of retirees who had lost their pensions to an embezzlement scheme similar to David's. "I know this feels overwhelming," Sarah told the elderly couple who had trusted their financial advisor with their life savings, "but you're not alone, and there are people who will fight to help you recover what was stolen." The gratitude in their eyes reminded Sarah why she had chosen this path. She was not just practicing law, she was using her experiences to help other people navigate some of the most difficult and confusing periods of their lives. That evening, Sarah returned home to find Emma, now a precocious 3-year-old, drawing pictures at the kitchen table. Emma's latest artwork showed a woman in a black robe standing in front of a building with columns, surrounded by people who were smiling and holding hands. "That's Mama at work," Emma explained proudly. "She helps people who are sad feel better." The simple description captured exactly what Sarah hoped her work accomplished. She was not seeking revenge against people like David, but rather trying to help victims rebuild their lives and find justice. As Sarah tucked Emma into bed that night, reading stories about brave princesses and clever animals who solve problems through kindness and determination, she reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed. The woman who had once been humiliated at a charity gala had become someone who spoke confidently to audiences of federal prosecutors. The wife who had been discarded like a useless business asset had built a career helping other people find their voices and seek justice. Most importantly, Emma was growing up in a home where truth was valued over convenience, where standing up for others was considered more important than personal comfort, and where justice was not just an abstract concept but a daily practice. "Mama," Emma said as Sarah turned off the bedside lamp, "will you tell me again about when you were brave?" Sarah smiled, settling back into the rocking chair beside Emma's bed. The story had become a bedtime ritual, though Sarah always adapted it to be age-appropriate and focused on the importance of helping others rather than the details of David's crimes. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, "there was a woman who discovered that someone she trusted was hurting other people. Even though she was scared, she decided to tell the truth because she knew it was the right thing to do." As Sarah told the story, she realized that Emma was learning the most important lesson she could teach, that real strength comes not from avoiding difficult situations, but from facing them with honesty and determination. The fairy tale that had begun with betrayal and humiliation had become a story of empowerment, justice, and the kind of love that grows stronger through adversity rather than weaker. And as Emma drifted off to sleep, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of their story were still being written. So there you have it, the incredible true story of how one woman's courage to speak up brought down a criminal empire and transformed her life forever. Sarah Mitchell went from being a silenced victim to becoming a powerful advocate for justice, proving that sometimes our darkest moments can lead to our greatest triumphs. But here's what I want you to remember from Sarah's story. Your voice matters. Whether you're facing betrayal, witnessing injustice, or simply trying to find the courage to stand up for what's right, you have more power than you realize. Sometimes speaking the truth is scary, but as Sarah learned, silence only protects the wrong people. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of courage and truth, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between staying silent or speaking up? What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Your thoughts and experiences could inspire someone else who's facing their own impossible decision. And if you believe in stories that show how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice, please hit that like button. It helps more people discover these powerful true stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than they know. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these incredible tales of courage, justice, and redemption. Remember, every subscription helps us continue bringing you these real stories of people who refused to stay silent when it mattered most. Because in a world full of injustice, we need more people like Sarah Mitchell, and maybe that person is you. Until next time, keep speaking your truth.